just have 3 E's, the things that begin with the letter E that will help ease your knees. 3 things I want you to approach every situation with, in your family, with your kids, with your parents, with your grandparents, with your aunts and uncles, your nieces and nephews, everybody. These 3 things. Ready for this? I'm going to give them to you, and then we'll talk about them. Number 1, examine the heart. Number 2, embrace wisdom. And number 3, enjoy laughter. Okay? All 3 of these are just kind of snippets of how we can effectively deal with and manage our families. Okay? Number 1 is examine the heart. Examine the heart. Now, the heart is absolutely, in my opinion, the most vital organ in the human body. You have to have, like, listen, if your lung stops, you're not dead, okay? If your kidney stops, you're not dead. If you lose a leg, you're not dead. Your heart stops, whether it's realistically or clinically, whatever, you are dead. Your heart is so crucial. You got to keep the heart pumping, right? That's why they say, we took the CPR class, and you do a lot of chest compressions and then a breath. And then a lot of chest compressions and then a breath. What are you trying to simulate? The pumping of the heart. Why? Because the heart is so important. That's why cardiovascular surgeons, especially the ones who are invasive, the ones that take the heart out of the chest, those guys get paid a lot of money, right? But the heart is so crucial. We need to examine the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue. I know when I was on the fire department, and we would do these triage situations, right? We'd have all these people on the fire department, and we would have a busload of people, and they were all laying on the ground. And it was your job to go up and evaluate the needs of the people, because you don't want to be spending time working on somebody's broken finger or broken leg when somebody is over here and they're not breathing. And you don't want to be working on somebody who's not breathing if somebody over here's heart has a weak pulse. You want to make sure you're doing everything you can. So we have to evaluate the heart. Now, whether or not it's your responsibility to correct the problem is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about evaluating the heart of the issue. Okay, Solomon knew that the heart was the most important thing. He says this, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Keep thy heart with all diligence. The word keep means to guard. So we'll guard your heart, protect your heart. Why? Why would Solomon say it? He would say that because from the heart flows all the issues of life. And if we can guard our heart, if we can protect our heart, the chance of living is so much better. I heard this one pastor, and he said years ago, he says, I try not to sleep, and I try to stay out of the hospital. Well, why don't you try to sleep, and why do you stay out of the hospital? He says, most people either die in their sleep or die in the hospital, right? So he says, I try to stay out of both of them. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. And I said, here's the, but the reality is this, if we can protect our heart, if we can guard our heart, if we know that the issue, it comes from a heart issue, that's what we need to examine. We need to examine. Luke knew that the heart is where good and bad came from. He said this, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good. And an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. Good and evil comes from something. So what you see on the outside, so here it is. Ready for this? You're dealing with your family. It's Thanksgiving time. And your Uncle Joe says to Uncle Tim, or Tom. Is it Tim and Tom? Sure. We're going to go with it. Says to Uncle Tim, Uncle Tim, I don't like that tie you're wearing. Is that, do you deal with that, or is there something subsurface? There's something subsurface. Why would your brother be at the other, why would your uncle Tim and Joe be at each other's throat? Why would they do that? Is it because they're looking for something fun to do? It's not. It's not because they're looking for something to converse about. He's looking for maybe something to say negatively, but it's not just for something to do. It's because there's something below the surface, and it's called the heart. Good and evil come from within. We talked about that in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 23, about the scribes and the Pharisees. Remember? They were outwardly like, it said whited sepulchres, but inwardly they were full of dead men's bones. Remember that? They were full of extortion and unjustness. See, on the outside, it didn't really represent what was on the inside, though it can be a good indicator. See, Tim and Joe, or Joe and Tom, they're at each other, but there's something below the surface. And let me tell you, when you're dealing with your wife, or your wife is dealing with you guys, you men, or you're dealing with your kids, and there is an issue, when there is an issue in the family, listen carefully, it originates at the heart. It always starts there. It always starts there. Matthew, he knew that your heart follows what you value. This is a great verse, by the way. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Listen, where you put your value, let me explain it this way. Where you put your value is where your heart will be. Okay? If I place an excessive value, and listen to the breakdown. If I put excessive value in one area, if I put excessive value in my kids, okay? Now, I value my kids. I love them. But they're not what I ultimately value, okay? I ultimately value a relationship with God, okay? Now, follow this. If I put excessive value in my kids, and I lose one of my kids, God forbid, I have lost everything that's valuable. And if I've lost everything that's valuable to me, I have no worth. So a misplaced value where your heart resides will only end up in trouble. We have to be careful where we place our value. Our value cannot be in the relationships we have in our home. Now, I say that on a big picture, okay? Now, again, I love my kids. I value my kids. I value my wife. But if I lose my wife, I haven't lost everything that's important to me. And that's the truth. Now, my wife is very important to me. You know where you end up, right? You end up in a state of hopelessness. You end up in a state of hopelessness. We have to be very, very careful where we place our value. Let me give you the application. 10 out of 10 times, the problems you have in your home are spiritual problems. Okay? They are spiritual problems in your home. 10 out of 10 times. There's no, I don't really find an exception to that. 10 out of 10 times, it's a spiritual problem. When brothers are at each other, when sisters are at each other, when brothers are against sisters, when moms are against dads, when dads are against their kids, and kids are against their grandparents, grandparents against the kids, whatever, it's always a spiritual issue. And if we don't get down to the brass tacks, the fundamental, the underpinning, we will always be dealing with a symptom and not the problem. Years ago, I heard an illustration. It went something like this. It was a financial illustration. And they said, if you ask a person making $30,000 a year what would make them happy financially, they would say $10,000 more. Okay? If you asked another person making $50,000 what would make them financially happy, they would say $60,000. And if you were to ask somebody making $90,000 what would make them financially happy, they would say $100,000. The guy made a unique observation. He said if you were to give the person making $30,000 the salary of the $90,000, that would make him tremendously happy. But only for a period of time. But only for a period of time. Until they needed $10,000 more to make them happy. The problem is not a financial problem. And you see, that's what we always attack things with what we see. It's not a financial problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a contentment problem. It's a covetousness problem. A person needs more because they want more, because they're not satisfied with what they have, which is what God has given them. So in a sense, they're really not happy with God's provision for their life. You see how that works? That's the rabbit trail, but that is a spiritual problem. The financial symptom is just kind of the byproduct of a deeper spiritual problem. We have to understand when we deal in our homes, when we deal with our families, what you see, what they're going through on the surface level, there's something deeper. There's something much deeper. And it's always a heart issue. It's always a heart issue. We need to examine the heart.